So today we will be touching the subject of social circulating capital, which is the whole aspect of real bills, and marginal productivity, which brings in the discount rate. So over to the professor.
Thank you. I still owe you the outline for the lecture yesterday on Adam Smith's real bills doctrine, and I also owe you the outline for the next lecture, number 15, which you haven't got, and I haven't got it yet, but tomorrow hopefully I will get it. In the meantime, we are discussing number 14, which is this morning's lecture, and you have the notes for that. We already talked about the social circulating capital. This is an idea due to Adam Smith. It's very useful to think about the movement of consumer goods approaching the market as a river which is emptying into the ocean. The ocean is your picture of consumption, where the consumer goods disappear, they are consumed, whereas the semi-finished goods and eventually becoming finished goods are moving to the consumer, and they have to move with a certain velocity, and if that's the case, then we talk about circulating capital, social circulating capital. The word social refers to the fact that the ownership of that mass of goods is really diffused. One might even say it's owned by the society at large. Even under capitalism, there is such a thing as social ownership, and a particular example is the circulating capital, social circulating capital. This is because there was a little discussion here in one of the breaks. Not everybody was there, but I think it was a useful little discussion. The question is the credit involved in moving consumer goods to the consumer. In other words, the credit represented by real bills. Is it a loan? Is the producer extending a loan to the retailer? And I took the position that the answer is definitely not. There is no loan transaction involved. And the moment the retailer signs the bill, I accept, and gives it back to the producer or the wholesaler, whatever the case may be, at that moment, this underlying good moving to the consumer becomes a public property. Society owns it. It's not helpful to think of individual ownership when the goods are moving, because ownership does change very fast. So let's just say the credit is extended by society, and the ownership is is social. That's why we call it social circulating capital. Maybe you don't like that. I'm not very firm on this point, whether this is helpful. Sometimes I think it is helpful to think of ownership. But the ownership question may not even come up. The ownership is more in terms of the real bills than the moving goods. So there it is, a big mass of goods are continually moving to the consumer. Goods enter into that phase subject to the 91-day limitation. Before that, whatever these goods are, they are not part of the social circulating capital. They do become part when the 91-day limit allows them to become part, and then they are part until the last consumer removes the good from the market and he will consume them. This is very important to treat these goods separate from all the other goods. There are other goods. There are bricks and mortar which go into buildings. There are, I mentioned the example of precision surgical instrument, or the pliers of the dentist, to talk about a less pleasant example. There are many other goods, and they are also moving, but we single out this particular movement of consumer goods which move fast enough, and it's important. The movement is important, and that it has to move fast enough. If somebody arrests these goods for the purpose of speculation, that particular supply of good will immediately cease to be part of the social circulating capital. Now, it's easy to see that the composition of social circulating capital is changing. It's changing with the seasons of the year. There are different types of food, different types of clothes which are needed by the consumer according to the season: spring, summer, fall, winter. And there might be also other changes having to do with consumer preferences. Consumers develop a taste for certain goods at the same time, no longer fond of another type of good, whether it's food or clothes. Fashion is a very good example. It's completely unpredictable what the ladies will prefer to wear in the summer. But one thing is sure, that their tastes, their preferences will change. So together with the change of consumer preference, the type of clothes which the shops will carry will also change. And we can say the same thing for almost everything which is part and parcel of the social circulating capital. I often talk about skipping ropes, which little girls use in skipping on the street or playgrounds or at schoolyards, because I don't know why, but skipping ropes are not always conspicuous. for some reason, little girls are subject to an epidemic of skipping rope epidemic when all of them are skipping ropes, whereas next year perhaps the fad disappears. Now, this is a good example for me because I illustrate that skipping ropes are normally not part of social circulating capital. Normally. But in certain years, we don't know why, but when little girls pick up the habit of doing the skipping, all of them, then 10 times or 15 times as many skipping ropes are sold by the retail outlets. And accordingly, the skipping ropes will be part and parcel of social circulating capital. But then they fall out of social circulating capital next year when girls, schoolgirls, no longer do this. Maybe in physical education classes they use it, but that's nothing in comparison when the epidemic hits, when really every little girl wants a skipping rope. Another example is the hula hoop. It's only certain years when hula hoops craze invades the schools and society, and then hula hoops are part of social circulating capital. Next year they fall out. So that's the way the market provides for unexpected demands. It cannot be predicted, but once the demand is there, immediately bills can be drawn on skipping ropes. For the previous 10 years, maybe skipping ropes could not be marketed, and the manufacture and distribution of skipping ropes could not be financed by real bills. The bill market would not touch bills drawn on skipping ropes. But in that particular year, when the craze has hit, all of a sudden, you can draw bills on skipping ropes, and that means that society can concentrate resources in the very fast and efficient supplying of skipping ropes to the outlets so that they will be available. Now, as I say, skipping ropes is just a funny little example, but there are many others which are far more important, but I like this example because that's really convincing. But in fashions and in food preferences, in clothes preferences, and in many others, you will find that unpredictable demand comes up out of nowhere. Real bills will be able to finance the supply. It's an entirely different way of financing this production and distribution of consumer goods from the normal demand, which doesn't show this kind of fluctuation. And it's a slower pace of the movement of consumer goods. In those examples, real bill financing is not appropriate, and it's financed through savings, interest, and this is something I indicated already is not subject of this course. We'll have to wait until another course will go into the question of interest rates. But as far as the social circulating capital is concerned, it's the real bill which finances it. I already emphasized that there are two great sources of credit in society. One has to do with savings, the other has to do with consumption. In many respects, these are opposite of one another, but we have to be very careful to distinguish between the two, because these two sources of credit are entirely different, and it takes a different analysis. Now that's one flexibility about the social circulating capital, namely its composition. What is part and what is not part. There is one criterion only which decides what belongs to social circulating capital, what doesn't. And that's the question whether real bills drawn on these goods will circulate or not. There is a bill market. I spent quite some time yesterday to explain that the bills are circulating. They are the primary assets of the banks in the old sense, commercial banks. The best earning asset a commercial bank can have is the real bill, maturing in 91 days. And that reflects the movement of consumer goods to the market at a reasonably fast pace. So, if you want to decide what belongs and what does not belong to social circulating capital, you have to ask the question, if you draw a bill on these goods, would the bill market take them and circulate them? Because believe it or not, the bill market is very picky, very choosy, and it will refuse to deal with a lot of bills for various reasons. In one case, it may be because, in the opinion of the bill market, the goods don't move fast enough. And in some other examples, the reason may be that, in the opinion of the bill market, the consumer demand is just not there to the extent that it justifies this risk-free, in quotation mark, risk-free nature of investing in bills. And there might be other reasons. And there is no appeal. If the market rejects the bill, they won't circulate, then the verdict has been passed. This particular good underlying that particular real bill is not part of social circulating capital. So that's one flexibility which we are considering, the composition of social circulating capital. It's constantly changes with the seasons, changes with consumer preferences, and for any other reason it may change. But there is also a second very important one where the flexibility of social circulating capital comes up. And this is quantity. This is the volume of social circulation. In the previous discussion, we talked about the quality, the composition. But now it's more the quantity. The social circulating capital can expand and can contract. In some cases, it's predictable because we know that for Christmas, pre-Christmas shopping season, the volume of social circulating capital expands. So say in the month of November and December, social circulating capital is beefed up. A much wider variety of goods are offered by the retailers for the consumer to choose for Christmas gift giving or whatever. And in January, the opposite happens. The social circulating capital contracts rather substantially. You will see that retailers might even close their shops for inventory taking, and you will see that they have sales, reduced sales. The merchandise which was not sold during the pre-Christmas season will be marked down and offered to the consumer at a discount. But of course they are not reordered. The retailers want to clear their shelves and storage space to get prepared for a different type of merchandise for the spring season. So in January, generally speaking, there is a big contraction of social circulating capital. Well, this is easy to predict because every year is the same. But there might be other reasons for the expansion and contraction of social circulating capital, which are unpredictable. They may have to do with natural disasters. After natural disaster, people tend to save, spend less, and the social circulating capital will immediately react by a contraction. And a recession or depression would have the same effect. People are very conscious of saving, and they are not spending as freely as they did earlier. The social circulating capital will pick up the signal. We'll talk about this in more detail, how they pick up the signal, and they will contract. The retailers thin out merchandise on their shelves. The river example is very helpful here too, because after a lot of rain fell in the mountains, the river gets wider, may even overflow its banks, and then it will contract when the rainy season is over. So these two types of changes in the composition and in the volume of the social circulating capital is subject to a lot of inquiry and questioning, because it's like a miracle. You just want to see how is it that the market reacts almost instantaneously to the mood of the consumer, because ultimately the consumer is in charge. You think of the Peter's crown, which he projected on the wall. The consumer is the what's the word? Sovereign. The sovereign consumer. There's no appeal. If the consumer says, I want it, that's the law. If the consumer says, I don't want it, or I wanted less of it, that's the law. No appeal. And as if by magic, all the retailers get the message and adjust. And we are going to see how. And that concept, which helps us understanding this, how the message is passed on, how the adjustment is made almost instantaneously, has to do with the concept of marginal productivity of social circulating capital. So this is a concept which we are introducing to describe this interaction between the consumers and the let's say the consumers, producers and distributors of the consumer goods. The concept of marginal productivity of social circuiting capital is really synonymous with the velocity of the movement of goods. Here's the producer, here are the consumers, and we imagine that these consumer goods make the trip, take some time. Now they can make this movement very, very slowly, or they can make the movement relatively fast, and in some cases very, very fast. And the market is quite prepared to deal with these different contingencies. If the movement is very slow, we have dealt with that question already, then the particular good falls out of social circuiting capital, and it's no longer our concern how this finishes its trip. There has to be a minimum speed, and once that minimum speed is achieved or occurring, then the particular good is part of social circuiting capital. Bills can be drawn on them, and their movement is financed by real bills rather than savings. But still there is a wide variety of different speeds which are possible. And we are going to describe this in terms of productivity. So I take the example of sauerkraut in bottles, and those of you who have studied Mises, human action, will realize that this is not very original of me, because Mises also takes the bottle of sauerkraut as an example in quite a different context. But I just thought that I will borrow this idea from Mises, and I describe productivity of social circulating capital in terms of, through this example of bottles of sauerkraut. Mises, by the way, denies that you can define meaningfully the productivity of a consumer good. He believes in marginal productivity, but he denies that productivity of an isolated item can be meaningfully introduced. So again, I take issue with him, and I allow you to be the judge, whether I am justified in criticizing Mises in this sense. So just think of that very simple example of a bottle of sauerkraut which is sitting on the shelf of the retailer. Think of a small or medium-sized supermarket, or even a large supermarket. The bottles of sauerkraut are sitting on the shelf for so long, and then the consumer comes and picks up a bottle, puts it in the basket, pays at the cashier, and so on. So the productivity of sauerkraut, in my dictionary is defined as, or it is determined by the length of the sojourn of the sauerkraut on the shelf. It might be sitting there for a couple of months, but you have that experience when you shop at supermarkets that sometimes the supermarket cannot keep the items on the shelf because they are picked up by the consumer in such a haste that they have to replenish them very often. So the question is, what is the productivity of the sauerkraut? And that's a very simple idea. You take the retail markup on the sauerkraut and divide it by the length of time it's sitting on the shelf, and when you annualize it, you come up with a percentage, and it's usually a rather small percentage. This example is explained lecture 14, bottom of page 2 and the top of page 3. So I leave it to you as an exercise to read it. I don't think you'll have any difficulty in understanding this. The outcome is that the productivity of sauerkraut is 2% at that particular time, which is subject to change, of course. The consumer may like the taste of it, and then they will buy more. In that case, the productivity goes up. If for some reason they like it less, then the productivity will be lower. In any case, there is a productivity. I really don't understand why Mises would not accept this argument. That yes, indeed, sauerkraut, as any other item on the shelf of the supermarket, has its own productivity. If you are the manager of a supermarket, you would know this very well, and you will keep an eye on the highest productivity items because you have to replenish the shelves with the merch, and even reorder this. So you send an urgent order to the supplier that we are running short and we don't want to see the item disappear, the item in the highest demand disappear from the shelf, because this means lost sales for me and for you and for everybody else along the line who is supplying these goods. So this is a common everyday experience, and by the way, sauerkraut. You have to know that Austria is the land of sauerkraut, and so is Hungary. This is very popular in North America. This example is perhaps not as fitting as they are here in Central Europe. Sauerkraut is a staple food. It's good for many things. It's good for cooking, of course. Wonderful dishes you can cook with sauerkraut, but it can be consumed right out of the bottle. In the summertime, if it's ice cold, it could be a very refreshing snack. And enough of that. That was Mises' example, and I took it over. So there it is. You have the productivity of sauerkraut. Now, the point I'm making is that every single item on the shelf, without exception, has a productivity which can be calculated the same way. And I already hinted that the manager or the retailer, I usually refer to him as the retailer, a retail merchant. Keeps an eye on the highest productivity because he has to replenish the items on the shelf. But really, the important thing which the shopkeeper, the retailer, does is watching the least productive item. So it's one thing, the most productive, but for an entirely different reason, he is watching like a hawk the least productive item, which could be sauerkraut. And now this is the question, and I'm putting it to you. What is the reason the shopkeeper is interested in the least productive item? Why is he interested?
It's not something we will no longer sell in the future.
I think I lost something at some point.
It's not something he's willing to sell in the future.
Yeah. The reason is because if the productivity drops more, he may just stop reordering it. He will let the existing inventory run out and be sold out. But he says, no, with that low productivity, I am no longer satisfied to carry that item. And this means that he will not reorder. Once the last bottle of sauerkraut is sold, there will be no more sauerkraut. If you want sauerkraut, you have to go to a specialty shop or to the producer and request it directly. But these general outlets, these retailers, will no longer carry it because the productivity is too low. They think that they can invest their capital better than carrying an inventory of sauerkraut when sauerkraut is in low demand. And that's what's happening. And there is no appeal against this because it was the consumer who decided that, and the retailer is just a servant of the consumer, of the sovereign consumer, and he will have to deploy his limited amount of capital in a better way. So sauerkraut is gone. Now, therefore, it might be tempting to say that the marginal productivity of social circulating capital is the lowest productivity of the item on the shelf of the shopkeeper. There is one trouble with this definition, and the trouble is that there are different retailers and they work with different results. And for some, the particular item, which you call marginal, sauerkraut in this case, is the lowest, but some others it may not be. So this definition would be ambiguous. And of course, an ambiguous definition is no good. You cannot build a theory on them. So we have to refine the concept. And to do that, we introduce the concept of the marginal shopkeeper. Okay? The marginal shopkeeper. There are lots and lots and lots of shopkeepers. They are more or less successful. And we take the least successful shopkeeper who's still in business. Those who are below that have already closed the shop and went into another trade. Maybe they went to work for wages because they could not make their business successful. So the marginal shopkeeper is the one among all the shopkeepers who is still in business, but if he fell further down, then he might be tempted to close in shop. So what decides the marginal productivity of social circulating capital is the marginal item on the shelf of the marginal shopkeeper. So please note that the word marginal is used twice in one sentence. On the one hand, we call the marginal shopkeeper, and on the other hand, we refer to the marginal item on his shelves. When these two marginal ingredients are considered, then you have precisely the point where the decision is made whether a certain item falls out of social circulating capital. But there's also the reverse. If business picks up, then the marginal shopkeeper will realize that he has lots of empty space on his shelf, so he can afford to carry a new item on the shelf, display a new item on the shelf, which now, in view of the greater demand, has a good chance to have the productivity, and it can compete with the other items, you see. So, in other words, the social circulating capital can contract. And this contraction takes place on the shelf of the marginal shopkeeper when he decides not to reorder a certain item, say sauerkraut. This sauerkraut then will disappear from his shelf when the last bottle is sold and no more sauerkraut available in the retail, and the marginal productivity went lower in response to the consumer demand. Now, if consumer demand changes, increases, then the marginal shopkeeper will want to refill his empty shelf space with giving new choice, greater choice to the consumer. And he may reorder sauerkraut, but he may reorder something else. Of course, his keenness of sense, what the consumer wants, will be a great guiding principle for him to decide what is that new marginal item which he will put on the shelf, which up to now was not available, but now he wants it, make it available to the consumer. So that's the mechanism. It's a very fine, very delicate mechanism it is. And you think about this, and I hope you will agree with me that this is quite important to look at in this sense. The change in marginal productivity of social circulating capital through the agency of the marginal shopkeeper. The word propensity to consume is notoriously due to John Maynard Keynes. And of course I'm in total opposition to his teachings and his ideas. But I did find the term propitious, and I'm using it. So I would say the propensity to consume is going to decide the actual volume of the social circulating capital, and it works on the margin, it works on the marginal product, the thing which I have explained. And of course there is the complementary idea of propensity to save, which is also Keynes, and we are going to talk about this in another course. I'm just saying to you at this stage that it would be a mistake to say that these two propensities are complementary, in the sense that their sum total is always the same, and therefore any increase in propensity to consume must mean contraction, propensity to save, and vice versa. This is not the case, and the reason is, again, Menger, who, as we know, brought in the idea of liquidity and marketability in the small, marketability in the large, and there is such a thing as a propensity to liquidity preference, I think is the word. Liquidity preference. So sandwiched between the propensity to consume and propensity to save, there's liquidity preference, which the term means the size of the cash on hand held by the consumer. And this makes it possible that the propensity to save and propensity to consume could vary independently of one another. There's no rigid relationship, reciprocal relationship between the two. But as I say, this is not really our subject here. I just want to give you that broader context. So we have now the concept of marginal productivity of social circulating capital. The merchandise with the lowest productivity on the shelf of the marginal shopkeeper is called the marginal item of social circulating capital, and that is the critical item which could, in the case of expansion, appear, or in the case of contraction, disappear from the shelf. What it means is, of course, that if it, in the case of contraction, the marginal item disappears, no more bills will be discounted or sold against the movement of that particular item. It doesn't mean that it's no longer available. It's available, but not as widely, because it will be the specialty shop where you have to go to the producer directly to secure your next bottle of sauerkraut. The point is that there will still be a marginal item. You see, the sauerkraut dropped out. It disappeared. It was the marginal item, but now it's no longer in part and parcel of social circuiting capital. So we have no more marginal item? No, we certainly do, but it will be another. So you see, the marginal item is a role. It's not an item as such, because that role is going to be played by different items, different consumer goods. Just as we discussed the marginal consumer, marginal producer in determining the asked price and the bid price. In the same way, now this marginal item is a role. It's not a fixed item, but a role which is played by different items. And let's just look at this a little more closely. Let's assume that there is a contraction in demand. The propensity to consume falls. And as a result, let's say the sauerkraut, which was up to now the marginal item on the shelf of the marginal shopkeeper, falls out. But another item on the shelf will take over the role to play by the marginal item. Okay? So there will still be a marginal item, but it will be played by another consumer good on the shelf. The question is, what does this mean in terms of productivity? More precisely, is the marginal productivity of social circulating capital increasing or decreasing at this point? What is your...
At what point? At the point where an item is removed.
The marginal item, the old marginal item fell out. It's no longer part of the... So the answer is?
Improve.
The marginal productivity of social circulating capital has gone up. A lot of people might be tempted to say the opposite, but the correct answer is Louis' answer. It went up because the role of the marginal item is taken over by another consumer good which has a higher productivity. It cannot have a lower, because the low productivity has already fallen out. So the marginal productivity of social circulating capital is increasing when the propensity to consume decreases, just inverse. And the converse is also true. If the propensity to consume decreases, no, that's what we just considered. When the propensity to consume increases, what happens to the marginal productivity of social circulating capital? It will decrease. Why will it decrease? Because if the consumer demand picks up, people spend their money more freely. The marginal shopkeeper will sense this immediately, and he will realize that now he can afford to fill some of the empty space on his shelf. So he will look around what would be the best new item to offer to the consumer, and he will pick one and he will put it on the shelf. But the point is that this item he picks is a new item in the sense that it had too low a productivity up to now, and that's why it was not on the shelf. But he wants to put it back he wants to put it on the shelf. And in order to do that, what it means is that the new marginal item will have a lower productivity. It brings in from the outside and now offers to the... This is very important for you to understand. This is on page 3 of my little handout, and please read it carefully. Make sure you understand. If you have a vague feeling, then please bring it up. If not immediately, then maybe this afternoon, tomorrow, whenever it occurs to you that this needs more clarification. I'm referring to the inverse relationship between the propensity to consume on the one hand and the marginal productivity of social circulating capital. So that's a rate. We are talking about a rate. It can be expressed, the marginal productivity, as an annualized rate. It is in terms of the markup of the marginal shopkeeper, and it is the productivity of this particular item. Now, the sentence, the single sentence which combines all this long discussion which has taken an hour for me to go through, it can be summarized in one sentence, and it reads as follows. It's page 3. It should have been printed in italics. It's not, so you can underline it. It's the last paragraph of the bottom of page 3. The productivity of the marginal item is called the rate of marginal productivity of social circulating capital. It is the rate at which the opportunity cost of carrying the marginal item on the shelf becomes critical to the marginal shopkeeper. And in parentheses it's explained who the marginal shopkeeper is. It is the first shopkeeper to change the composition of his stocks in response to changes in the propensity to consume. The reference is to the marginal shopkeeper's opportunity. You see, the word opportunity cost refers to something. So now we answer the question, what opportunity? The reference is to the marginal shopkeeper's opportunity to carry in his portfolio. That leads to the next topic we'll discuss this afternoon. To carry in his portfolio bills drawn on other shopkeepers against faster moving merchandise rather than carrying on the shelf a marginal item. So with this I close now. This sentence is a forward-looking sentence because I have to explain the reference to the bill market. You see, this is another arbitrage. We'll look at this in this afternoon's lecture. We look at this as arbitrage of the marginal shopkeeper who has a choice. He can carry his capital in the form of goods on his shelves, but he can also carry his capital in the form of a portfolio of bills which are drawn on faster moving merchandise ordered by other shopkeepers who work with higher productivity, and this fine arbitrage between the two markets, on the one hand consumer goods market, on the other the bill market, and there's this arbitrage done by the marginal shopkeeper, is at the heart of this particular theory. And you may notice the similarities, this arbitrage and the arbitrage in determining the ask price, the bid price, and this idea is everywhere. This is all part of the coordination changes which the entrepreneurs, in this case the marginal shopkeeper, will be instrumental in doing. So with this, I call it
Half an hour break,
Half an hour
coffee,
break.
see you in half an hour. It's on. There must be a whole series of questions that everybody is eager to ask after the end of that. But before we do, I will just show you that I'm not always gold basis. My day job was equities, and I still like equities, and I still like applying whatever I learn to equities. And it's very easy to do the calculation that Professor talks about in terms of calculating the productivity of the marginal, the productivity of the goods that the shopkeeper holds. Now, it's very easy to figure out operating profit. Operating profit is profit post all of your cost of goods, after depreciation, after amortization as well. So if you have an operating profit of 5 on sales of 100, you've got a 5% markup.
EBITDA.
EBIT, not EBITDA. Post depreciation, post amortization, pre-interest, pre-tax.
What is EBIT?
Earnings before interest and tax. Yeah. So that's broker talk, but the synonym for that is operating profit. So it's quite easy to figure out what the markup is from the P&L.
Right.
But how do you calculate the sojourn? Does anyone know?
The what?
The sojourn.
What the hell is that?
If you have access to the profit and loss, the balance sheet and the cash flow, the sojourn is the length of time that the item spends on the shelf.
Okay.
Does anyone know? It's very easy. You look at the balance sheet, working capital, debtors, creditors, and what's the missing part of working capital there? Inventory, stock. So let's say stock is 20. You look at the ratio of sales to inventory to calculate an approximate figure for the sojourn. Okay. So I recommend that everybody, go and get the balance sheets of as many shopkeepers as they can, as I did. The publicly traded companies are not the best thing to do this calculation for, because they're not the way they originally were. Tesco's is a fully integrated company now, and it doesn't just sell fruit and vegetable as it did back in the 50s or whatnot. But you can still get the accounts of, in the UK anyway, you can get the accounts of any limited company. So if you see, an electrical shop on the high street, go and get their accounts and go and do this calculation, because it's very interesting. And then list the productivity and find the marginal item yourself. So it's not just theory, this is practice as well. Right. So, questions?
Stunned silence.
Is that our homework?
That's your homework. Is to get the balance sheet of every retailer on planet Earth. And,
On the street of the Trans 47.
Ben.
What does propensity to consume mean?
Professor, what does propensity to consume mean?
All right, propensity to consume means that perhaps we should think first in terms of changes in propensity to consume. If consumers are inclined to spend more of their income, then we say the propensity to consume is increasing. If for any reason the inclination to spend drops, then we say the propensity to consume decreases. this is a fairly intuitive idea. Now, if you want to make it mathematical, I would have to take a little time to think about before I could, but perhaps you are ready to...
No. I'm not, I'm afraid. No, mathematical description.
As I said, it's an idea coming from Keynes, and I just find it useful to borrow it from his book, and it gives you this idea of the relative movement of the marginal productivity. Well, I have some idea how I would approach it mathematically. It would somehow be the reciprocal of the marginal productivity of social circulating capital, which is a number, which is a rate. So you could take its reciprocal. But one would like to be careful and just see if other things should be taken into account.
A lot of psychological factor there. When people feel rich, they're more likely to spend. And if they see their equity growing and their shares growing, if this changes around, or perception changes around, they're likely to hoard. What Professor said was liquidity preference, call it hoarding. And then whether you save it or spend it or hoard it depends on your perception of how things are going.
That's why it's so important to manage expectations.
It should be intuitively clear that there is such a thing, right? Because especially we experience now a period when people are retrenching. This is falling propensity to consume. That's the period we are in. And we are hoping this will change back to a more normal level of propensity to consume. So it's a useful idea. The same way propensity to save, but they are not in rigid relationship, as I pointed out.
Mark?
You were mentioning that there was two kind of savings, like consumer-related savings and another concept, the normal traditional saving, and I guess this has got something to do with the different interest rates, discount rate. I'm not sure. Could you perhaps go into this, or is this upcoming?
I think that will be the subject of the afternoon lecture, won't it? The introduction of the discount rate.
Yeah. And the arbitrage between the arbitrage of the marginal shopkeeper between the consumer goods market and the... But you mentioned interest rate?
I wasn't sure if interest rate, you were saying this term consumer-related saving or something. I didn't quite get this.
Consumer-related saving?
I think the professor was saying then there's consumption and there's savings.
Yeah.
And consumptions is more related to a discount rate concept. And savings is more related to an interest rate concept. And the two are quite distinct. The formation of each.
And this
more on this later.
Okay. So
But this is anticipating something we are not going to cover in this course. This comes in a future course where we discuss interest rates per se. I'm just mentioning interest rates here as by way of comparison, that one should not confuse the two.
No? No more questions? Well, it was all perfectly crystal clear then, I think.
Well, we have time. Well, since you took up that subject, but you didn't mention sauerkraut.
Sauerkraut. No.
So, because we are talking about one particular item and the productivity of that particular item. So this is more general.
This is more general. I mean, it makes more sense if you're talking about, you know, a retailer who just sells televisions, for example, you know, and you have to compare it to another retailer that sells radios. Now, there aren't retailers that just sell televisions and retailers that just sell radios. You know, so you have to consider the set, you know, you know, you can't boil it down to as perfect a calculation as you want, you know. But you still have shops that sell different types of goods, you know. Dixon's in the United Kingdom is a good example. You know, Dixon's just sells electrical goods. Now, Dixon's might be next door to a Superdrug, which sells cosmetics and shampoos and whatnot, like that. You know, so there is a limit to which you can take it, but you can still more or less approximate, without actually running the business yourself, what the productivity of these various items is or are.
And what's the practical use of this?
Well, you can calculate what the professor is talking about here. It's good to know. Yeah, and him.
Probably Dixon is not the marginal shopkeeper, no?
Might not be. There might be other shops like Dixon's, you know, that sell electrical goods. You know, I can't think of many. They've all gone out of business, to tell the truth. Yeah, you know. Why would you want to know this? Well, the idea is that you ultimately want to find what the approximation to the discount rate would be. You know, there is no market observed discount rate at the moment. That doesn't mean that a discount rate doesn't exist. You know, it's just hidden somewhere. You know, just like, and we're going off subject here, you know, the Wickselian concept of the natural rate of interest versus the market rate of interest, you know. You need to find a way of approximating what this natural rate of interest is, you know, when there is no actual tangible way of doing it. You know, you can only get a grasp of its boundaries, as it were, you know.
But what is this natural rate of interest? I mean, this is a whole another topic.
This is another topic.
But is it just in short sentence the increasing productivity under a gold standard?
No.
Short sentence.
No. We're going off kilter here. But the point is that, you know, when you say, for example, that you're going to lend out 90% of all deposits that you receive, you're going against the subjective preference of what the people would actually want. So you're deviating from a natural rate, you know. So it's a similar concept, you know. Unless you actually get back to the mechanical process, you can't see how the difference arises in the first place.
The liquidity preference.
I don't know, what is that? Don't throw these broker terms at me. I mean,
Demand for cash.
right, demand for cash.
That's hoarding.
Yeah,
That's what you stuff into your pillow.
yeah,
Hopefully it's gold, not paper.
yeah.
Okay, there's a little time, so I think I want to touch on that subject of the social circulating capital today. I mean, we don't have a bill market, but we do have social circulating capital. What happened is, or at least this I think is a good way of describing or trying to understand what has happened, is that the banking system has hijacked social circulating capital. So this is a dramatic development. the bill market was a completely open market because the bill itself is an open document. It lists the item by item the consumer goods which are being shipped or sold, and or where they are stored, or they are shipped, and in what form, whether it's air, freight, or ocean transportation, name of the boat, insurance documents, etc. They're completely open. If somebody wants to know how much of a certain type of bill is changing hands, that's very easy to get this type of information. Now, what happened is that I explained yesterday that you can have real bills and the market for real bills without the banking system. Not one single bank, but the bills have their own wings and own power, and they can circulate that way. When banks appear on the scene, and I think historically it's correct to say that banks have appeared on the scene later. There were bills circulating first, and banks were attracted. And there is a good aspect of that, the appearance of banks, and there's a bad, or sinister aspect of the appearance of the banks. And I usually explain it in terms of two intermediate concepts. Before banks appeared, there was a so-called discount house, and there was an acceptance house. Now, the discount house is the good guy, out of which the good type of banking evolved. And the acceptance house is the bad guy. This is perhaps too much of a generalization, but it might be useful to think of the evolution of the banks in these terms. That there was the good guy and the bad guy. Now, the discount house is a business which buys up maturing bids and then collects, just finds the drawee, who is ultimately responsible for paying the bill, and presents the bill and collects. Okay? And of course, takes a cut appropriate to the services rendered. And that makes it very convenient, because if you just hold a bill for a certain amount of time, because it's an earning asset and you need an earning asset, you don't want to carry large amounts of cash which do not earn any return, then there's the problem what to do with the bill after maturity, because once the bill is mature, no more earning is involved. The earning aspect of the bill has stopped. It still has a value which you can collect, but unless you collect immediately, you are losing out. So it's very good to have an institution such as the discount house, where you take your maturing bill shortly before maturity and then sell it to the discount house. And the discount house specializes in collection, so it will know exactly what to do. That explains the good aspect of commercial banking, because that's really what the commercial bank does. You know, it acquires bills and keeps them to maturity and then collect, and this is an earning asset for the bank too. So that's the good aspect. Now, the sinister aspect of commercial banking grew out, as I suggested, from the acceptance house. the acceptance business owes its existence to the tremendous success of the real bills. And it attracted imitators, and a lot of the imitators followed the form but not the substance of the real bill trading. For example, those who speculated in increasing grain prices, knowing that there was a poor harvest or any other reason, then you could take two tradesmen. One is the miller, who had a flour mill, and the baker, and they used grain to make it available to consumer in the form of bread, and they could conspire. They could conspire in the sense that they, rather than move the wheat or flour or any other form, they arrest the movement and hold it in storage, because they hope that if they wait, they will be able to sell the wheat at a better price. This is completely against the real bills doctrine, which assumes the movement. Movement has to be fast enough to qualify the bill for circulation. But if there are these speculators, what is wrong with this is not speculation per se. What is wrong is that you are speculating with other people's money, and that's the bad thing. As long as you speculate with your own money, it's your business. And who are we to criticize whether it's good or bad? If you are good at it, you help society and you help yourself to profits, but only if society benefits. The bad thing is when you speculate with other people's funds. And that's what's happening in the case of conspiracy between the miller and the baker. Arresting the movement of the wheat. They pretend that the wheat is moving, but this is just a pretense. In fact, the wheat has been arrested, the movement has been arrested. And they try to take advantage of the lower discount rate as opposed to the higher interest rate. If they want to do it properly, they would have to find a venture capitalist if they haven't got their own money. And the three of them, Miller, Baker, and the venture capitalist, decides that it's a good idea to store wheat in expectation of higher price, and then finance this, but that will be financed in terms of the higher interest rate. But if you try to finance it in such an underhanded way through the conspiracy of the two of them, the Miller and the Baker, then it's at the expense of society, because the lower discount rate is made available by society to finance the movement of these absolutely necessary consumer goods, which have to be available to the consumer. So, as I say, there was a temptation to imitate real bill circulation, even when the necessary elements were missing, such as movement. And the acceptance house was born of the idea that any kind of bill we can put in circulation, because all is necessary for the acceptance house is to make sure that it won't lose money at the end of the transaction. And you can do this if you insist on a collateral. So here's somebody, a speculator or just somebody who wants to spend money and finance his consumption at a lower rate, and offers a bill which he signs and even invents something, some imaginary goods. He would list it on the bill and invent a boat. Imaginary good is in the bottom of the imaginary boat, and fake it that this is a real transaction, and goes to the acceptance house. I mean, the discount house would reject it out of hand. It's ridiculous. They would know that there's no such boat, there's no such good. But the acceptance house doesn't care. He says, okay, you want that much money? Fine, put up collateral. It could be a bond, could be stocks, could be real estate documents or something. And as long as the acceptance house is satisfied that even if that bill goes bad, it won't be paid in gold at maturity, the acceptance house can take responsibility for it, because then it will satisfy itself by liquidating the collateral. The collateral has to have a higher nominal value than the face value of this fictitious bill. And then, this goes, and even the discount rate could be low enough, and the name of the acceptance house has such a high recognition. Usually families which have several previous generation of successful activity in the bill market, and the people won't ask any questions because the acceptance house accepted the bill prior to maturity, which is a guarantee that the acceptance house will pay the bill regardless of whatever the underlying transaction is. And this might work for some time. What is necessary for us to see is that it might work for some time, but it might not work forever, because as Lincoln said, you can fool some people some of the time, even older people some of the time, and some people all the time, but you can be sure that you will not be able to fool all the people all of the time, which is involved in this kind of fraud, involved in the activities of the acceptance house. I'm not saying that all acceptance houses were bad. Some of them were honest operations, trying to help the bill market to function properly, but there was this type of temptation to commit fraud. Now, what goes wrong with this is that if too many acceptance houses are trying to do this, then the volume of these bills will be too high. And therefore the acceptance house will have to, the various acceptance houses will have to liquidate the collateral simultaneously. So let's assume that these collaterals are bonds, and then all these bonds are dumped on the market at the same time, which will result in a fall of the value of the bond, and therefore it can happen that the liquidation of the collateral is not yielding enough for the acceptance house to satisfy its own claim, and the acceptance house is in danger of collapsing. And the bond market, which means higher interest rate, and the real estate market, if there are mortgages involved in this type of collateral which we talk about. So all the garbage is accumulating in the attic, and one point is reached when the whole thing comes crashing down. And this did happen. One famous example, the Baring Brothers of London. It was a very good name, but it started speculating in Argentina or somewhere, and as a result, the acceptance house collapsed. Now, what I'm suggesting is that the bad aspect of commercial banking is embodied by the acceptance house, because what happens is that the banker, the commercial banker, conspires with, say, the baker, and starts rolling over bills, and this is a no-no. A bill must never be rolled over. If the gold is not available at maturity, then the bill has to be paid all the same. It must not be rolled over. And as long as only the discount house is involved, it's easy to see that bills are not being rolled over. But once the acceptance house, or under a different sign, a bank, is getting into this business and fall into the temptation of committing fraud, then what happens is that say the baker has a bill discounted and he couldn't pay at maturity, so he goes to the bank and says, hey, why don't you do me a favor? Just roll over this bill. Pretend that this is now an entirely new transaction, but it's still the same flour which the baker could not, or the baker held back the flour from the market in hope of higher prices, whatever. The fact is that some of the commercial bankers will be open to this temptation and say, okay, for a consideration, I will do it for you. And since the bill is accepted, it will circulate the same way. But that's a fiction, because the underlying good is not there, or it's not moving. And this, well, you can use another phrase. You can say that the corrupt banker shelters the bad paper in the portfolio. It's no longer in the public domain, because you have no right to inspect what is in the portfolio of the banker. The banker protects bad business, puts a good name on a bad business. This is what has happened in many cases, and I'm suggesting it to you, this is what is going on today, where the commercial banks, big and small, have hijacked social circulating capital, squeezed out the bill market. No more bill market today. It simply doesn't exist. But the social circulating capital does exist. I mean, whatever we eat, whatever clothes we put on, and whatever fuel we burn is all part of social circulating capital. But the way it's being financed, the movement of that social circulating capital, is fraudulent. Because rather than in the open bill market, where everybody could see what's being traded, and how fast these are moving to the consumer, instead there is this cozy agreement between the commercial banker and the traders, and it's a breeding ground of corruption. And therefore, I would suggest it to you that this hijacking of the social circulating capital by the banking system, aided and abetted by the central bank and the government, because with proper inspection, the bank inspectors would say, this is not eligible, this is not eligible, and we throw out all the garbage in time before the toxic waste gets overwhelming. But the government doesn't see it that way. The government says it's as far as the numbers are good, and we can say that the economy is increasing, GDP is increasing, that's all fine, that's all we want to project, an image of always going up, never a reverse. And the government gives its blessing to these bad practices, and the government will instruct the bank examiners to look the other way when they see something fishy. So this is what is happening today, or a large part of it. I'm willing to commit my own reputation that this is a large part of the cause of our financial difficulties, which started showing up in 2008, but it's the result of a much longer period when the results of the hijacking of the social circulating capital took place. And this is all a consequence of eliminating the gold standard, eliminating the bill market, and this is what we have today. And unless there's a radical surgery, you have to cut out the cancerous cells from our financial system, and that's not happening. The government is bailing out these big banks, which are like the acceptance house at the verge of collapse. The government is pumping artificially created money into the system to keep the game of musical chairs going. Well, I thought it was perhaps helpful if I made these comments. Well,
No more questions?
then it's
Comments?
time to adjourn, and
See you in the afternoon.